Hello, this is Dennis Speed, and I want to welcome people to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for September 9th. Yesterday was Lyndon LaRouche's birthday. He would have been 99 years old, and we wrote this about it to put it up on the site. And it said, Lyndon LaRouche, economist, statesman, and philosophical thinker, proved that a single person with no externally designated authority could, through the power of reason, change the world. By means of not only his writings, but his action and person, LaRouche proved that humanity can invent, discover, and deploy physical laws that not only change but improve the biosphere. His numerous proposals for science driver programs in thermonuclear fusion and space, his proposals for a just reorganization of the international banking system, for fundamental changes in educational designs for instruction in elementary and secondary schools, and for identifying the role of classical forms of dramatic and musical composition in increasing the capacity for creative thought, are the very ideas which provide the path forward for Earth's next 50 years. We put that up on the site so that people would have an idea of why Lynn's ideas are haunting the corridors of power as we speak and are the only way out, actually, for a circumstance which has sort of been, on the part of the oligarchy, decided for the rest of us, and it's one that we're going to have to reverse. They have decided, and you can see that with the coronavirus process, that it is inevitable that the transatlantic world sink into decay and die. And whatever it is that people may think they're doing, it's irrelevant to what's actually happening. We've seen in recent days freakouts by British intelligence. Yesterday, a highly decorated British commando named Sergeant Trevor Colt authored an article entitled, Biden is more dangerous to the West than the Taliban. We also had yesterday, or actually a couple days ago, a warning from Tony Blair in which he said Islamism remains a first-order security threat, and the West should prepare for potential use of biological weapons by extremist groups, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair said on Wednesday. So he is predicting or forecasting that there will be biological warfare conducted because of what has happened around Afghanistan. Of course, it was the British, and particularly his foreign ministry, that explicitly got the United States into the Iraq War with their contentions concerning the weapons of mass destruction. So as we go into this occasion of commemoration, let's be clear about two things about what we have to do. There's been a truthful identification of what happened at the time of 9/11. You don't have it now. And the questions that are being asked concerning whether or not what has happened with the $2 or actually $8 trillion in all of the wars since 9/11, and the thousands of American lives and millions of lives worldwide that have been taken as a result of those wars. The answer to the question of whether that was all worth it, well, the answer is actually no, unless the actual cause of what happened is identified and the perpetrators are brought to justice. That has not happened. It's contended that that happened with the ostensible killing of Osama bin Laden, but that's not the case. And the situation we find ourselves in tonight requires that we confront something and tell the truth. This country has been in a kind of quasi-police state since 20 years ago, 2 days from now, September 11th. The Patriot Act was emergency rule The Constitution of the United States does not and has not actually been in effect since September 11th, 2001, and that's the significance of the surveillance that's been done. We'll be taking many of these matters up over Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I want to go right now to Diane Sayre, who is here and is a candidate, independent candidate for U.S. Senate. And she's going to get us started because there's a series of things over the weekend we want you to be involved in and involved in organizing. Yes, you. And there are different kinds of ways to do it, and different kinds of ways to participate, and we want to make sure your help is enlisted in that, as well as in the actual political organizing that we'll be doing and using this weekend as a springboard for that. So I'm going to go right to Diane, and then we'll open up the queue for questions and comments. So, Diane?
Yes. Thank you. So as Dennis just said, we are now approaching the 20th anniversary of these attacks on 9/11. What I wanted to go through was a little bit about Lyndon LaRouche's forecast, and also hopefully it will work. We're going to listen to a radio interview, just part of an interview that he did. He happened to have a pre-scheduled interview on that day exactly as these events were unfolding. And I will say I was out on the streets of Manhattan today at New York University, and you realize that for anybody 25 or younger, they have not known the United States prior to 9/11. And there were many, many things set in motion, which at this point I'm sure I could not remember. You'd have to sit down in a group of people and reflect on the things that changed in the wake of those attacks. But certainly the surveillance state, and everybody was terrified. Helga was reminding us of this. I'd forgotten all of the yellow ribbons and the American flags and, that kind of thing. And George Bush saying, if you don't go out and go shopping, the terrorists have won. It was a really crazy time. People were very on edge. And because of the fear, people were prepared to give up some of their freedoms, or to think, well, maybe it is legitimate to have wild security procedures at the airports, and maybe there is a reason for the NSA and the CIA and the FBI to have every detail about where you are at every minute, as they do for anyone who carries a smartphone. We lost a lot. And so what I want to just reflect on is what LaRouche said already in January of 2001, where he warned, and we had an election in 2000 where Lyndon LaRouche said the most likely outcome of this election is that nobody will win. And I was really puzzled by that. I couldn't even imagine an election where there was a question about who won. It was similar, maybe like a dry run for what happened in 2020. And I foolishly, since I couldn't imagine this happening, did not tell a lot of supporters I was talking to on the phone because I couldn't explain it. Well, sure enough, election day comes and goes, and we don't know who won. And it goes on and on, much longer, by the way, than what just happened. In fact, on January 3rd, when LaRouche gave this webcast, it still wasn't quite determined. It looked like it was going to be Bush, but he had not been certified. And he was talking about making John Ashcroft his attorney general. And a question came into LaRouche from members of the Congressional Black Caucus at a webcast he was giving about what he thought about the nomination of Ashcroft. And aside from Ashcroft's Southern racist proclivities, LaRouche said, this is the kind of guy you bring in if you want crisis management. What do I mean? He said, well, Bush is going to be weak. If he ends up becoming president, there's no clear mandate because there was so much confusion about who won the election. So he's not going to be able to get his policies through. So he's going to need to do the kind of thing that Adolf Hitler did with the Reichstag fire, where some mentally ill person who he, is able to influence burns down the parliament building, sets the parliament on fire, and then Hitler comes running into an emergency session. We're under attack. We're under attack. The communists have attacked us. I don't have time. We have to do things quickly. And the parliament voted for something called the Notverordnung, emergency decree. No more vote, no more debate. Hitler gets to rule as a dictator because we have an emergency. And that's what LaRouche meant by crisis management. And in effect, we have had that since September 11th, 2001. Everything is run that way. You're not supposed to ask questions. You're just supposed to do it, because if you don't do it, there will be unspeakable consequences. And we've had it with global warming. Greta Thunberg has told us if we don't stop exhaling, the world might end in 18 months for all we know. Similarly with COVID, where you actually have a real pandemic, which requires real actions. But the population has been driven into a reactionary state, so nobody trusts the government anymore, and there are obviously certain good reasons for that. So rather than trying to work with the population or to come up with an actual public health and sanitation plan, which makes sense, everything is emergency, emergency, you must do this, and it gets people very on edge and creates a very bad and dangerous dynamic, and I would say it's by design. So that was January 3rd of 2001. LaRouche warned that the Bush administration would need an event which could be used to get the state of crisis management. Then in August of 2001, LaRouche put out another warning of a terror attack on Washington, D.C., because the various conferences, groups that were being whipped up by a guy named Teddy Goldsmith, the brother of James or Jimmy Goldsmith, you'll hear this in the interview, who were tied into various terrorist networks, environmentalist networks, something like the Antifa, who had done riots in the 1999 conference of the, I guess it was the World Trade Organization or something, that was meeting in Seattle, and there were plans, LaRouche thought, for something similar at a meeting of the IMF World Bank in D.C. They tried to, it was thwarted. So LaRouche put out a warning in August of 2001 of a likely terror attack on Washington, D.C. And in fact, on the morning of September 11th, I and my husband and others were actually out on the beltway surrounding Washington, D.C., handing out warnings of a terror attack when we started getting word. We were doing an intersection from people driving by. Have you heard what's happened? Have you heard what's happened? The trade towers have been struck. So what I would like to do is, rather than tell you what LaRouche had to say on the morning of 9/11, I'd like you to hear, and I've condensed, you may not quite be able to tell, there's 4 little clips I put together in one of an interview that actually went on over an hour and a half, but it'll give you kind of the gist of it, and I apologize, you can hear Jack Stockwell clearly. For some reason, the audio of Lyndon LaRouche is not that clear, but I think you'll be able to make it out. So if it's possible to go to that now, that would be great.
Well, I'm still sitting here looking at this incredible picture, this incredible image in front of me of this burning World Trade Center as these 2 jets have just slammed. One jet has slammed into each of the 2 towers. So we'll go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and get my guest on here with me. Mr. LaRouche.
Yes.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Jack.
Well, what a pleasure and an honor to have you back on my program again. I was hoping to move the discussion initially with what we were going to do here into the area of the sublime.
Yes, right.
But now with what has just happened in New York with this, which, you know, it's interesting enough, just yesterday I received, I think it was just yesterday, a bundle of leaflets from your organization in Leesburg that I regularly pass out of my office, warning of terrorist attacks in America here very shortly.
Yeah.
And here we have, the morning that you're on my program, what's happening in New York at the World Trade Center. I don't know if you've seen these images or pictures yet on the television.
I haven't yet. I was sitting up here working and just heard about it before I went and called you.
Yeah, well, the smoke is billowing out of the one tower here. My wife called me a moment ago, and apparently they caught live on film the second jet smashing into one of the other towers.
So obviously this is not exactly an accident.
No. No, sir, I don't believe it is.
I mean, it's not a coincidence. It's obviously, this is so remote a probability that there has to be intention in this thing.
Well, it's one thing for somebody to strap on a jacket made of dynamite and walk into a diner in downtown Jerusalem. It's another thing to jump inside of a Learjet and go smashing in the side of a building like that.
The thing you have to look at in the context in which this is occurring is two things. Now, first of all, the first suspicion that's going to be on this is Osama bin Laden. That name is going to come up prominently, whether as suspicion or just suspicion.
Certainly.
And the second thing, which is not unrelated to the Osama bin Laden question, is this festival, which is planned, really a terrorist festival for Washington, D.C.
At the end of the month.
We have a global process. The financial system's coming down. That's always a dangerous thing, because when the entire system is being shaken up the way it is now by the financial collapse, political things happen because various people try to intervene and orchestrate events by spectacular interventions, which will change, shall we say, get public attention off one thing and put it on another. So this is obvious. I mean, I cannot draw a conclusion except the circumstances tell me something rather evil is behind this thing. And I don't know which, but they're both connected, because I know the Goldsmith brothers, for example. Jimmy Goldsmith was key in helping to create, he's now deceased, Osama bin Laden and people like that, the Taliban and so forth. And at the same time, his brother, Eddie Goldsmith, who is still very much alive, is sort of the spiritual godfather of this movement, which is planning to inundate Washington, D.C. with some pretty nasty stuff at the end of this month.
The FBI is now saying that a plane was possibly hijacked for this attack. If you can do that with the World Trade Center, what could you do with the White House?
Absolutely. I've been very concerned about this. You know, I'm not very sympathetic with what some of these agencies do. But I'm concerned not just as a presidential free candidate, but I'm concerned with the security of the United States and the peace of the world. And this is not good for the health of the nation or the world. These things should not happen. We could prevent this kind of stuff, but we just don't do it because someone says let it happen.
How would you prevent terrorist activity?
Well, the thing is, if you dispense with the myth that there are a number of unknown people up there coming out of the myths and nobody knows where they come from, then you would say, how can you stop the terrorist operations? If you know how the world is actually organized, you know you cannot organize a sustained preparation for terrorist operations in any country without the backing of a powerful government or governments. So that if you know what the operation is, and I would say, you know, I've been warning against this Teddy Goldsmith operation all along because I know what it's connected to politically. It's extremely dangerous. And if I had been president or in a similar position during this period, I would have had an all-out, very discreet, but very all-out and effective discussion with some other governments in the world And we together would have taken appropriate steps to try to neutralize this kind of danger. Of course, you can't be 100% in this sort of thing, but you can do a pretty good job. And 2 planes, now that's pretty big. That's one plane that might not be preventable, but 2 in the same shot, no, that's not small time stuff.
Lynn, you were saying there a moment ago that the system was over. Now, what a lot of my listeners need to understand, Mr. LaRouche, is the difference between our economic systems of this country that's driving this market crash and basic economics. But there's a difference between, you can go in right now and change the economics to save the system, rather than leaving the same system of economics that's currently afloat and watching it crash on the shores of absolute bankruptcy. There are things that can be done right now to save our system and leave it intact, or not the system, but the economy of this country, with a drastic change in the system.
Very simply, you just use the principle of the general welfare, which is as it's actually intended in the preamble of the Constitution. As Roosevelt used that authority, you declare bankruptcy when needed. For example, most of the banks in the United States are potentially bankrupt if they're not already bankrupt. Well, do you let the banks shut down? If you don't, you have the Treasury Department move in on the Federal Reserve System, which is the mother of these things, take over the Federal Reserve System under bankruptcy reorganization, and under the authority of bankruptcy reorganization in cooperation with the states, who also control banks, you make sure that banks that must keep their doors open will keep their doors open. You must ensure that employment is maintained. You must ensure that actually it grows. You must ensure that pensions are paid. You must ensure that communities function. And you must also have some growth. Otherwise, how are you going to reorganize out of bankruptcy if you don't have some real growth? Which means that certain projects, like infrastructure projects, necessary ones, are put into place to absorb some of the unemployment which is inevitable and get the economy moving again. On that basis, using nothing but the precedents we have in our national law, national history, we could reorganize this economy out of a virtually total monetary and financial collapse by the will of government and the cooperation of the people, with good leadership in a very short period of time.
We got a minute left. Can you bring something sublime out of this?
Yeah, I think the point is, when you get a crisis, which is like a war, I mean, this what is reported in New York, you're talking about 50,000 people possibly killed. Do you realize that's in the order of magnitude of the official death toll?
Of Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Yes.
So this is not a minor thing. This is not something that happened. This is not a terrorist incident. This is something much bigger. But when you get into a crisis like this, the first thing you have to do, especially terrible crises, the more terrible they are, the more this principle applies. Do not panic. Do not shout fire in a crowded theater. Get the people safely out. And what's needed now is to recognize that we got to this mess because the institutions of our government, forget who did it, forget who did whatever's done. But think about this could not have happened if our government functioned. And the reason our government didn't function and doesn't function, I hope that changes quickly now, is because nobody was paying attention.
Yes.
Therefore, let us pay attention and recognize that when we were running the economy the way we were running it, the things we've been doing, we have set ourselves up for this kind of crisis. The thing to respond to a crisis like this is to remove the long-term and medium-term causes of the crisis itself, of the situation which allowed this to happen and come to this pass.
Lyndon, we've got to go.
Good.
Thank you so much, sir, for being my guest today.
Thank you, Zach.
We'll talk to you again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good. So I think you can hear, one, if Lyndon LaRouche were president of the United States, had they not run the witch hunt against him as they did, that nothing like 9/11 would have been allowed to occur. And what I wanted to just take up is the last thing he said, which I was very struck by. He said, forget who did it. Forget who did whatever's done. But think about this could not have happened if our government functioned. And what does that mean? And then he says, remove long-term and medium-term causes of the crisis itself. So what was leading into this over the long term, the medium term, and then how do you get out of it? And the unity of this crisis with the impending blowout of the transatlantic financial system. And you begin to realize why Lyndon LaRouche was seen as such a threat to the entities that would have been behind this, who orchestrate such actions, and this action in particular. So just now to fast forward to today, Helga Zepp-LaRouche identified back in July a window of opportunity with the announced withdrawal of the United States troops from Afghanistan, the ending of that war, that created a potential to dramatically change our policy direction and to reflect on what has been wrong with our actions over these 20 years. And then on top of that, you have the families and the survivors of the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 families, who have been on a quest for 20 years to get to the bottom of what happened. Unlike many other people in the country, they didn't go about business as usual, but said, we have to know who killed our family members. We need to know what happened here. And you definitely have a clear indication of internal involvement by various intelligence agencies and probably military and probably higher a level than that, when you reflect on the fact that for 20 years there's been tens of thousands of pages of documents which have not been made available. And one thing that everyone knows is the shameful protection of the Saudi royal family and Saudi Arabia, but it is not merely that. There is a certain relationship between the Saudis and the British, particularly British Aerospace, and a deal worked out with Margaret Thatcher for a tanker of petroleum a day to go to Great Britain in return for, I don't know what, unlimited massive amounts of weapons from British Aerospace, which is what allows Saudi Arabia to do what it does, and probably many other terrorist networks to be armed, because I'm sure they don't have giant advanced munitions factories in the middle of Rocky Mountains and deserts over there where you don't have electricity or running water. You've had that, but also would have created a slush fund, all of that petroleum sold on the spot market. At the time of 9/11, I think Executive Intelligence Review estimated it would have been something like $80 billion available for such a thing. So who in the United States has been interested in covering this up, and to what end, and what has been the effect on us? And to liberate ourselves from that, we, one, need to pursue this and get to the bottom of it and clean out the rot from our own intelligence agencies and also our financial system that would have done this. Two, we have to implement a solution. And the proposal for Afghanistan, where you have right now 18 million people hungry on the brink of starvation. That's about half of the population of Afghanistan. And you have over 4 million drug addicts, heroin addicts, and the population of that country, 80% of them are under the age of 30. So you have a nation which potentially actually has great potential if the United States will work with China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, the nations surrounding Afghanistan, on a real program of reconstruction, which must be led by the Afghani people themselves. And Helge has proposed that, in a sense, a coordinator or of this, that you could have a commission working on this, perhaps along the lines of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which he helped to create, headed up by Pino Arlaki, who people may have seen if you watch the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche organization conferences, was the former drug and crime, I forget the name of the office, but the Office of Investigating Drug Trafficking and Crime at the United Nations. And when he was in that position, he actually had been in negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they had nearly eradicated the heroin production by the end of the year 2000. So at the point that the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, the opium trade had been nearly wiped out. All of that changed after the invasion. So I say that to indicate that this can be done. And I can assure you that if we were to shift our policy and work in these nations with these other nations, as LaRouche said we have to do in the U.S. on the principle of the general welfare, we might also change our policy within the United States. And all of our veterans who have been so horrifically abused by being sent into wars based on lies for which there is no purpose, and being ordered to do hideous things, could instead be, like the people trained at West Point, a very important force for building the infrastructure necessary to deal with the pandemic, to deal with water management, to make sure that we don't have completely insane situations like people drowning in basements in Queens because of rain, which is absolutely criminal, and this should be changed. So we should take this moment, this 20th anniversary of September 11th, many of us on this call, had the benefit of working with Lyndon LaRouche for years, and we have a moment where things can turn, but they will not happen without our input. So that's what I have.
Okay, I'm going to open up the queue for comments and questions. And Diane, what I would like you to do is to tell people a bit about what's happening tomorrow.
Tomorrow is going to be a concert, and I'm very pleased, actually. It's going to be the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, and it's going to be a virtual program online, and you can get information on it at sinycchorus.com or Tim, or however you found out about the call. It's tomorrow night at 7 p.m. It's a 9/11 memorial concert. There will be a short message of greetings to that concert from Terry Strada, who is the leader of the 9/11 Families United for Justice Against Terrorism. And it will feature some music sung live by a small chorus in the large cathedral, Our Lady of Pompeii, which is in the village not far from Ground Zero, and it's a really wonderful church with phenomenal acoustics. We had a rehearsal there tonight. And then part of it will be recorded because our chorus includes people from all over the country now, and even Ibero-America. We were learning Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. We chose that for the year of Beethoven, but it's also a very, very appropriate thing for this 20th anniversary of 9/11. And you will not be hearing the entire Mass, but the Sanctus and Agnus Dei segment of the Mass, performed by a virtual chorus and an orchestra designed by our artistic director, John Segerson. It's really quite something. And the Mass itself is very powerful. which you will hear as most of Beethoven's music is, but this is really one of his crowning accomplishments. And that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. And the tickets start at $5.
Okay, very good. So we're going to go to questions. I just want to read something which is from Rudy Giuliani. He was asked yesterday what he most remembered about that day, and here's what he said. He said, when we got to St. Vincent's Hospital, I saw the stretchers and the doctors and nurses on the street waiting for patients. It looked like a scene out of a war movie. On Canal Street, we heard a big explosion. Within a second or two, Bernard Carrick, the police commissioner, called and said that a second plane had hit. On West Street, people were running and getting hurt by stuff coming down from the top. As I was looking up, I saw a man in the window on the 101st floor. It froze me for a minute. The image that comes into my head pretty close to every day. I felt like I knew what he was thinking. Do I want to burn to death or jump? I saw the man jump. Then the final thing is that he spoke with Father Michael Judge, well-known figure in Greenwich Village in that area. He said he always used to use humor to deal with stress. This time I could see fear on his face. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, I'll be praying for you. When I heard that they had found his body, that was harder than losing almost anybody, because he really helped me understand and empathize with people going through tragedy, going through death. Now the reason I chose to quote these ideas is because not of the horrendousness of the day, but there's been a claim that somehow people are forgetting about this, or today is not a good day to talk about this, and people want to talk about COVID and this and that. And here's my message to everybody that's encountering that. You get that from people. What you tell them is, to the degree to which you are preoccupied with something other than this, then you are going to create the conditions where it will happen again. It's not the terrorists that are creating that. It's your preoccupation that's creating it. We already know from Tony Blair that British intelligence, etc., are intending that biological weapons attacks occur. Of course, many people have talked about COVID in this way, but as usual, what's happening is that people are being distracted from what is intended. Now, this movement, and the purpose of this movement, was created for the purpose of not making tragic mistakes and telling people the truth, and then deploying for the opposite result. And that is what we are involved in this weekend. And we'll talk more about that, about Saturday and Sunday, after we take a few questions and get a few comments.